All right, let's just dive in. This is the MVC iteration planning for the content editor in the wiki. So I'll just dive right in. I think a good place to start would be to address some of the questions that you had put in Slack and then made its way into the issue, Enrique. So I don't know if you want to kick it off that way or if you had anything else you wanted to start with.
No, I'm gonna follow your lead. I can verbalize the questions. I think that's useful. Um, so my first question is about um, if the content editor MVC will be able to edit existing wiki pages, or it's gonna be focused on producing only new content. And the reason that I asked that question is that if the content editor will be able to edit existing pages, we need to support every type of content that those existing pages may have. And that heavily influences the amount of work that we have to deliver in the MVC. I
Yeah.
shared a link in the document with a table that describe all of the type of content that GitLab Flavor Markdown supports, with the goal of making more evident what I'm talking about when I say a lot of work.
Yeah. And I think that was extremely helpful and was what I was hoping to do in preparation for this meeting, and you beat me to it. So I appreciate that very much. I think I've thought about this a lot since I wrote my answer in Slack, and I think it's still accurate, which is that in an ideal state, yes, we want everybody to be able to access the new editor, as soon as possible so that they can edit their existing content. But I thought about it over the past couple of days, and given the scope that you've outlined, I think this could be a vector for our MVC to get out there faster, start getting feedback, and deliver value sooner in an organic and elegant way, as long as we're not. I think my fear is that we would end up building so many safeguards and divergent editing experiences, like that the user would, that the author of the content would be unsure which editing experience they're going to get, and that we might end up with code that doesn't need to exist for very long that's checking like whether or not this content was created with the new editor or not, and whether we should display a certain button or not, or which one should be the default or not. That logic, I'm maybe overcomplicating it in my head. That logic may be fine. We may be checking for that anyway. There may be easy ways to identify that, but that would be my only real concern for this approach.
One question I had is, I don't think the determiner is like whether it was created with the new editor or not, because they could create something with the content editor and then go edit it in the product, like in the existing wiki editor, unless we restrict them from that somehow. And I don't know how we would. We'd have to like set a flag per document and then add something that's not supported and then go back and try to edit it with the content editor again. It would really have to, the determiner would really be like, does this document contain any tags we don't support, regardless of how they got there or where it was created?
That's a good point. And maybe then the distinction isn't about editing existing wiki pages, but whether or not we show this editing option if we don't recognize a certain part of the document.
And that has the potential to be a lot more confusing. They could say, oh wait, I had this option to edit it this way and now it's just gone. Why?
Yeah, that could make the criteria to display or hide the editor even more complex. At the end, the problem is not content that was produced by the content editor, is content by Markdown that was produced by the user. and uses those content types that the content editor doesn't support yet. So the only path where we can fully protect the user from having that kind of bad experience is by just allowing them to produce new content with the editor.
Yeah.
Which will have the same experience. Like they could say, "Oh, I created this document with this one experience, but now I can't edit it with that same experience."
Yeah,
Going
that
forward.
feels a little odd. I think this will segue into the next part of the conversation. We don't need to we don't need to hang up on all the details of it right now. I think we can move on to question 2, which will probably lead us down the path of making a decision anyway.
Cool. I'm gonna memorize it. So what editing tools do we want to provide in the MVC?
Yeah, which leads us to that great table that you created that outlines the difference between supporting Common Mark, the basic Markdown extensions, plus a couple little extras, GitLab flavored Markdown, and then just Wiki specific content within the GitLab flavored Markdown, and then also just like overall HTML parsing. So it's certainly a sliding scale, and my initial answer was, we can negotiate it during this conversation. Your estimated weights on all of these, like, I think before seeing this, I would have said, like, let's just wait. Let's ship it with the ability to render everything in GitLab flavored Markdown. But that's a lot of work, probably not achievable by 14.0. So I think I would turn this around with another follow-on question, which is, what happens to our editor if it sees content that it doesn't recognize or can't render?
So first, to answer that question, we have to understand the import and export flow of the content editor. So when a user opens an existing Markdown document, the content editor will convert that Markdown to HTML using the Markdown API. And will display the content in the content editor. Perhaps the content editor could ignore though the content or the type of content that it doesn't recognize. But at the end, the content editor should regenerate the Markdown to save it in the Wiki page, and that's where the problem lies. Like when it regenerates the Markdown that it opened in the first place, it's gonna be incomplete because it's not recognizing the unsupported nodes.
Yeah,
Which has
and
the potential to massively corrupt existing files that are opened with it if we allow that, not just brand new ones.
right. Yeah, we wouldn't want that. And this is a familiar discussion from the static site editor days. I mean, we've tried to tackle this from a few different sides. I can say from what I would probably like to see as somebody working in the editor. If there was part of my document that was unable to be rendered for whatever reason, whether it was invalid syntax to begin with or an extension we don't know about or something like that, I would hope that the editor would sort of isolate that, let me know that it's uneditable, but preserve it in the document in place as I'm making changes. And I understand the technical challenges that exist in that user flow, but I think one of the goals we will have is to address the problem that the static site editor currently has, which is that it reformats the entire document every time it's opened. And one of the promising things we talked about with Prosemirror and TipTap was that we could be rendering just the changes, right? So I guess what I would say is, if we were to have to make a decision of whether or not we invest in an architecture that preserves uneditable content by only changing the content that the user has edited in the content editor, I need to find a better way to be more specific about that. But the and then write only that part of the document back to the markdown. I would say if we can solve that, then we can do a lot less for the MVC, because now the existing documents have far less chance of being corrupted, and we would be able to say, like, you know, we fully support common mark. If you wrote your stuff in common mark, you're good. But if you're using any of these GitLab flavor markdown extensions, you know, just wait a minute and we'll get to it eventually. But yeah, so anyway, I'm making a lot of assumptions there. That may not be possible this early. Please let me know if that's not realistic.
There are technical limitations, but I think that there are also user experience problems with that approach, because imagine that we keep in place the markdown that the content editor can't edit, but how do we display that within the content editor? What does that look like in the first place? Because if we are not like changing it, it's because at the same time we cannot display it either. So if we could display it, we wouldn't have the problem in the first place of regenerating it.
Would it be possible for Prosemirror and TipTap to identify content that it doesn't know how to convert to HTML, sort of isolate that on the abstract syntax tree and present it in raw markdown, but maybe like in a different typeface, different color, slightly different treatment, so that we know it's not like editable content?
So the problem here is that Prosemirror is not dealing directly with the markdown. It is dealing with the result of processing that markdown through the markdown API. So it's like, even when it recognizes like HTML coming from the markdown API output, that it doesn't know how to process. It's not like directly relating that HTML to the markdown.
Got it. Yeah. So it's definitely a case where we don't know what we don't know, or the editor doesn't know what it doesn't know. And
we could use approach of rendering the markdown directly to a Prosemirror document by using a markdown parser in the client. But we decided not to go that way because it would be at the end way more expensive.
Yeah.
Because we would have to implement markdown parser extensions for GitLab flavor markdown.
Yeah, and we may someday get there, but I still think that's the right call, even given these challenges. Yeah, I'm still having trouble wrapping my head around whether there is an iterative step at all here. Like, this is the GitLab flavored markdown spec. There are potentially
I think
20,
Enrique got to
25
the
points of work there. Like we kind of, it sounds like we kind of just need to do it because otherwise we're going to risk corrupting files.
right. I think Enrique got to the crux of it. It's like the decision to not implement Markdown parsing on the client leads us to we're rendering Markdown on the back end. That implies we have no connection to how that Markdown is related to the HTML or the prose mirror representation at all when we round trip it back to Markdown on the client. And this is sort of the crux of the whole reason we're putting these tests in place. Like this whole loop of we start with some Markdown, the server turns it to HTML, the client turns that HTML into a prose mirror internal representation, and then we turn that back into Markdown. Do we end up with exactly the same Markdown that we started originally with on the server? And for everything in that table, the plan is we're going to have a test that asserts that yes, we do end up with that. And anything we don't do, like we're going to have to do work that's essentially throwaway in the end to like say, all right, well, we don't handle this, but we still need to know everything about it and where it is and how it lays out in the document in order to not handle it, instead of doing the work to just handle it.
Right, right. Yeah, that was my concern with taking a partial approach, which is, are we going to have to build something that's checking for the existence of something we don't know when we could spend a little more effort to just support it? Okay. Well, I mean, we can sit on this for a minute and think about. My desire would be that we support all of GitLab flavored Markdown on at least rendering of it. Again, this was clarified in the issue, but like we're not talking about customized editing controls for anything like tables or anything like that. We're just saying rendering in the document. If we can at least render everything GitLab flavored Markdown for the MVC, then we can hopefully display existing wiki pages, create new wiki pages, and not risk corrupting any documents. And it sounds like maybe the discussion is just, does that mean we can't have it for 14.0, or is there another option in here that I'm not thinking about?
I don't see one. I think we have, with the test framework, we have a pretty good way to ensure we don't introduce corruption, or at least as corruption is found, to put a very strong regression test around that, so once we fix it, it never occurs again. But as far as like not doing it all at once, I'm not seeing an easy way forward.
It makes sense to me. I think towards the end of your comment in this issue, Enrique, the stuff about diagrams and HTML tags, I'd like to dig in deeper to that later, but I think what I'm hearing is the gist of it is like we just need to build, this is what it's going to take to support the different content types in GitLab flavored Markdown, and that may put us at risk unless we can find a way to accelerate. It may put us at risk for rolling out an MVC in 14.0, which is fine. This was an ambitious goal to begin with. I don't want to sacrifice something for an arbitrary deadline. So
we can always feature flag this like very strictly on a per user level and say everybody who uses this, you need to realize you can only use headers. Like if you use anything but header tags, all bets are off and your document may be completely corrupted. Like maybe that's just us, but we can sort of dogfood it if people understand how they're going to use it.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. Like if we wanna get feedback about the editor usage, we can at least restrict the scope of the rollout, and that's the reason that I was thinking about the opt-in or opt-out about in the editor. Like if you see that this editor is corrupting work that is important for you, you can just opt out of it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good segue to your other question, which I think.
Roman had a question in this
Oh,
chat.
yeah.
He said per user for new wikis. I think that's the same problem. Like, doesn't matter whether it's new content, it's whether it's supported content or not. So even if a wiki was created, they could then edit it via the old way, presumably.
I guess that's a good question.
Or like you're saying, the wiki, like when they make a new wiki, they can only edit it with the content editor and therefore only do what that supports. Ah,
That's what I think, right?
That's
just
an
a new wiki,
interesting
and you
idea.
can just like create it new with the new editor, and you just can edit it with the editor. And then slowly we build it there because it gives us like a way of like beta testing it, and we just grow it over time. And then once we're feature complete, then we roll it out backwards to existing ones.
Yeah. It's not even new wikis. There's like a per wiki flag. It's like, okay, this supports the content editor, which is a very limited experience, and it only gets that flag from having been created by the content editor.
But Wiki also supports pushing content via Git, so
yeah,
that can be a little bit tricky.
I think we'd have to just have a big disclaimer: don't edit this directly in Git.
You can just remove that button there. It's just like you don't show them what is checkout link for this wiki. You can disable it on the back end.
Yeah, but they can still they can discover the URL. We probably still want a warning at least.
We'll disable it in the back end.
There is an interesting idea that was shared by Brett. I don't remember his last name, but he works in the plan group. It was about how Atlassian, when they first, I think, redesigned Confluence, they just ditched Markdown, and they decided to store directly the prose mirror document format. Now in the wiki, we support 3 types of formats: ASCII docs, RDocs, and Markdown. For the sake of brainstorming, perhaps we can just support a 4th format that is like, the one that supports the content editor. In that way, we wouldn't even have to support Markdown directly. I mean, the Markdown conversion round trip that takes so much for to support.
I think that's a great idea because GitLab flavored Markdown doesn't work anyway with the other formats like RDoc and ASCII doc. It doesn't work with them. And it would be expected that this new format would not work with GitLab flavored Markdown either. I mean, something that is GitLab flavored. So I think it makes sense. And eventually we can iteratively add GitLab flavored Markdown support to the content editor and like make a back and forth transition.
So that will allow us to iterate in the user experience that we want to offer in the content editor. And we can see Markdown support within the content editor as a second iteration, as a second phase, to integrate the content editor in other parts of the product.
So in this scenario, you would never switch to the source view, and you wouldn't be able to check out the repository though, right? You wouldn't be able to edit locally.
You can actually. So if you go to Wiki editor right now and check out the source view, your files are actually called have an extension of .md, ASCII, whatever. This one would just have an extension of, let's say, JSON. And if you check out the source, you would get like a JSON representation of what the structure of the document in source mirror is. And you can go ahead and change that if you know the syntax. It would be similar to changing like Atlassian's document format.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we wouldn't recommend doing that.
Yeah, so I love that you would bring it up, and I do see the advantages here, but from what I've heard from users and from where I think we want to use this elsewhere in GitLab, I think moving away from Markdown as the source and abstracting and removing the ability to directly edit that source is going to be a non-starter for a lot of our users. I've heard specific feedback that people want WYSIWYG editing, but if you take away the ability to drop back into Markdown, I mean, we've had this internally from our discussions with Static Site Editor. This feedback came up. If you take away the ability to let me like view the raw source, I'm not going to use it. Paraphrasing, but that's a really big hurdle, and I understand why that's maybe easier or more, we can more iteratively work in that way by creating a new document format, but I don't think that's a strategy that we can choose on this call. Like, we would have to revalidate whether or not anybody would use it. And based on the feedback I've heard about Atlassian's document format and the frustrations people have working with Confluence and how they're trapped to the Confluence editor, and they would prefer to work in their local environment, or they would prefer to write in raw Markdown, even if we iterate towards a really delightful content editor experience where you can type Markdown or even type ASCII doc into the document format, there are going to be those users that want to check it out locally and use their local Markdown editors. There's going to be people who want to see the source to be sure that it's being formatted the way they want, or in the context of like issue descriptions and stuff, I think this is a different conversation, because I don't think viewing the source is as important there. But I also imagine this being something where, you know, we want to ultimately use this in, or use this to replace our strategy for the static site editor product as it is now. Forcing a new file format into that is not going to realize our vision for using this to edit static sites. Even if we just picked one static site generator, we would then need to like have our own fork of it that understands this format. And I think it would be a limiting factor in how far we can spread the content editor throughout GitLab.
Yeah, I think I agree with that.
Yeah.
I'm definitely one of those users that wouldn't use it. And it also brings up like migration issues. If this wouldn't be a permanent thing, we have to like, it's sort of viral. Like if they edit it, if we allow them to edit existing content, it's going to get converted to this new content, and then they can't get their markdown back, and that would upset people. Or if we only allow it for new content, it's really going to be people that are they only want the WYSIWYG experience, which like I get really annoyed at that because I'm so much more efficient in Markdown, and I think an engineer-heavy audience or people that are familiar with Markdown at least are not going to be happy with a solution like that.
There's also incremental like complexity when we start thinking about this as something that we could edit our handbook with. Like, there's a lot of data-driven, you know, helper files that are in our handbook that are written using Ruby. When we start trying to solve for that case, like, it becomes, I should say, the complexity is all on the shoulders of the WYSIWYG editor, where in the future we may rely on a strategy that's more like what I described, which is like we identify a content type and that just gets edited as source, and like we don't need to build custom UI for writing queries against a random data helper or something like that. It's worth considering still. I'm not trying to put my foot down or anything, but the guiding principle for me has been that Markdown needs to remain our source of truth. I am intrigued by the idea, if we could make it work, about only letting users opt into this for new wikis, where we could then give them upfront, like, you created a new wiki, say, hey, you want to try out our new editor? By the way, like, don't use these extensions because it's just not going to work, right? Like, then progressively add to that and eventually make it available to existing wikis. We still would have the problem. And so I guess I was going to ask the question, like, what happens in the editor if we do corrupt the file? Like, how aware of that can we be? Can we say, you've opened a file, you're editing it, and you hit save, and you're like, well, there's some unexpected stuff here. You might want to actually not commit this change, right? Or are they only going to find out after they open it up again later and see a bunch of like raw HTML injected into their Markdown?
I think that the easiest way around that might be to just expose some like history UI. Say, did your dot get completely corrupted? Here's your last, here's how to check it out in Git and revert it. Like, it could just be pointers to some docs of how to get back to the version before, so they're not completely lost.
There is also
revert.
A related problem. Well, I think that this is like, there is a side to this, like, that is what is the expectation of the user when the WYSIWYG editor modifies existing Markdown. And this is a problem that we had in the static site editor as well. And I think that we've been working on the assumption that the WYSIWYG editor will protect every Markdown preference that the user put in their existing Markdown content in the source. And that's impossible. I think that's something that is not only true for a WYSIWYG editor for Markdown, but it's true for any WYSIWYG editor. Like, if you use a developer tool that is like for drawing user interfaces that generates an underlying source, that usually will also like not protect existing source, because the WYSIWYG editor is a tool that generates source, not that necessarily modified existing one. And I think that's a perspective that we have to share or be clear about with users. Like, when you're using a WYSIWYG editor, like, usually like, you don't, this is like the most simple way of putting it, but you don't care that much about the source or the structure that is following. And I feel like that will be a resistance that we will meet once we share the content. We publish the content editor. Like, how do we deal with that? And we create the assumption that the content editor is like, it really takes away the control over the source from the user.
I think that the expectation we set is we're going to render it the same as the backend does. That's our only assurance. We're not going to ensure that your white space and your new lines and everything else remain the same, but it will render the same.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And I think for the vast majority of people who are going to use the content editor as their primary experience, that's actually a benefit, right? I mean, I think back to my early days using Dreamweaver and learning web design, right? Like, I didn't have an opinion yet about how it was writing out the structure of my HTML tables. I just wanted to see the right columns and cells, and they got better at formatting the automatically generated source over time. And I got better at writing it from scratch and eventually switched over to writing it myself. But it's an abstraction, and it's a visualization of existing content. The the 2 points that I think are really important to make are, we are not concerned about rewriting white space in a table or preserving specific elements of their markdown syntax in favor of like a consistent output. But I do think we need to, I don't know, I think we just still need to keep in mind the problem that we were running into with the static site editor, where we're rewriting the whole document. So for example, if I have a bulleted list and I open it up in the content editor and I change an item on the list, I don't care if you've written that and reformatted it to hyphens instead of asterisks. But if you've taken my whole document and parsed it, and it's like, 600 lines of code, and now my diff is like impossible to read, then we've seen the frustration there. So I think it's about reformatting the delta in as granular form as we can, and keeping that consistent while preserving the structure of the underlying source that hasn't been edited, if that's even possible. But I hope we can get there. In the context of this discussion, though, I think the point is that we need to, I lost the train of thought where I was trying to summarize what you were saying, Chad, but the general idea that
rendering has to be the same.
Yeah, that the rendering is consistent and that we can render everything. Because if we don't render something, or we render it incorrectly, right? Like if we pick up, I'm trying to think of a GitLab flavor. Let me look back at the table. A GitLab flavored markdown extension. So like if we pull in a math equation, that seems like something that's probably pretty important as somebody who intentionally wrote some math into a wiki document, right? And then we just write that out and it's completely different, or it's wrong, or it's just not formatted, and it's just like some random string of text now in the document. That's not okay.
So one thing I want to kind of throw in this or so, because Eric, you bring up like this diff view, right? And I think this is like a totally negligible. I can't pronounce this word.
Negligible, yeah.
Negligible, right? It's a negligible kind of aspect of this whole thing or so, because like the majority of things where we do it is so people never see the diff. You don't see it on wikis, you don't see it on comments. You only see always the result, right? So you never have like this weird thing where it reformatted things.
That's a good point for the context of the wiki. Yeah, that's important to remember.
Static site editor is where we saw this before, is where people care the most about it because they're concerned about the original markdown. Wiki
and it has this handbook flow with
they don't care as much.
I don't think that they were even concerned about the original markdown. They were concerned that the static site editor was producing a merge request with 200 lines of change sets.
Yeah,
and they had to deal with that.
Exactly.
Because like somebody needs to go in and approve it, and then it's like it gives like this level of uncertainty. So, are these meaningful changes? Do they mean anything?
Right.
Exactly.
It's like just visual or so. It's like something we can't ignore to a big degree.
So it's really only when this flows through an MR that we care about preserving the
markdown
format at all.
Which is important to say, like this doesn't need that granular level of like isolation of changes, certainly doesn't need to be in the MVC. Go ahead and rewrite the way you format unordered lists across a whole document for the wiki, because nobody's going to see it or care.
But I want to highlight that once we have to do it, we can do it. Like we will have access to entire abstract syntax tree that represents the document, and we can run 3 comparisons and get, the like only generate the markdown based on that difference.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's certainly scope we don't need to introduce into the MVC. So I think that's good to point out, Roman. Thanks.
So I think like in this case, like for the 14.0 release and for the next steps, I think for us it's really important here to be like to be ambitious. Because like the problem is if we say, oh no, it will take us like 5-6 months or so till it's like ready, where we say now we feel ready to implement it or so. This is like 5-6 months or so that we cannot use to kind of like push a certain narrative forward in a company about like, hey, this is the value, this is the vision where we want to go, because we just delayed this point of vision, this entry point. Just this little thing that I saw from Enrique where I say like, oh, you can type something and like now it's bold. Like this is already like this clicks with me and say, okay, this is the experience I'm looking forward to. And if we can provide something for 14.0 where say, even if it's like super limited in scope and capability, and there's like only certain ways to use it by saying, okay, I added something to the document where say, create my first page. And there's like my create my first page with the new super awesome experience. That is totally fine. We do it this way and it's like very narrow, but at least it gives us like a playground where people can feedback it. We can self like use it constantly, and we can push this narrative forward and kind of share the vision. Because ideally other teams are starting to be like interested in this as well, saying, hey, we want to adopt this as well. We want to use it like here in issues and comments and everywhere. And then we maybe even get the luxury at editor to have like some things taken off of our plate so we can focus on content editor more.
Mhm.
I really think this is one of the most important things that we work on right now, about pushing the UX quality of GitLab in general forward to the next level where we should be.
For
Yeah.
a user opt-in with like big warnings, like this only supports this tag.
Yeah.
It may corrupt other stuff. Be really careful editing any wikis with this. Okay, now go and use it.
Yeah, I think you're right on, Chad, with back to the original question, which is should this be opt-in or opt-out? Like I think for now, until we are super confident that we're not corrupting files and that we have extensions like nailed down for editing and rendering everything in GitLab flavored markdown, we should this should be an explicit user opt-in, and we should have an interstitial that's like, please look at the documentation and understand the limitations very clearly. Like only these types of pages can work, and you won't know until after you write the changes whether you've messed up your page. So keep that in mind, and we can find a friendly way to write that out. But I think a strong warning, and it offers an opportunity for us to keep the user informed as we do make changes to it, and we can have an interstitial that's updated with the latest support. So opt-in for sure. We should move forward with that. And then we can talk about at what point we're ready to expose that opt-in to people outside of GitLab, and in what context there. But it sounds like opting in for any wiki is the same risk as opting in for new wikis, because if we're not limiting their editing options for local editing. Well, actually, let's revisit that logic. So if we give this option only for new wikis, and then that's when you opt in, then we could take away the button for cloning the repository. We could have a new UI, slightly tweaked UI that makes it clear that you're in sort of a new wiki experience. We could remove the source editing aspect for now until we can get editor light in there, and we can be a lot more intentional about, like, I don't know if we could warn them like as they're typing in there if there's anything going wrong, but
I would see it as like a sticky flag. Like if you create a new wiki with the content editor, then you get this flag. But if you edit it via any other means, like if you manually push it or anything else, it sort of turns that off and you can't use it anymore because then it could get corrupted. That's the way it would have to be.
I'm thinking back to how Confluence did this. So when at my last job, we were moving from Dropbox Paper, which was a fairly delightful editing experience, by the way, to Confluence, and they were in the middle of transitioning from their standard editor to their newer, like, block type editor, and it's with the new document format that they were creating. to get to it, you had to create a new page and choose the meeting notes template and specifically use a new editor in it. And you couldn't switch between editors on purpose. Sometimes it would accidentally load it with the old editor, and that was a bug that we want to avoid. But and eventually they rolled that editor out to all template types, and I'm sure they had document conversion and stuff like that. But this seems like a similar path in a good way. I'm trying to highlight that this is like a potential good strategy. It seems like a potential path for us to introduce it with more confidence early and let people make the decision on whether it's the right fit for them. In the chat, Himanshu, your discussion about how we are using an intermediate format and whether or not we expose it to the user, it might be that that's something we could explore. Like if you maybe a new wiki using this intermediate format, or even potentially a new page, now you choose the type, whether it's wiki, you can do that per page, right? Whether it's Markdown or ASCII doc, RDoc. So if you choose GitLab wiki doc type, like you no longer have access to the source and the file is saved with an extension after the Markdown file so that it can't accidentally be opened. Or what I would suggest is that we don't intentionally write out the prose mirror document format. Like if we could keep that Markdown, but add an extension on it that just like makes it not Markdown, if that makes sense. So if we're writing Markdown, that's great, but we want to like make sure people aren't encouraged to edit the raw Markdown, because then we have problems.
Yes, in the drop down, if you select any of the other formats like ASCII doc and anything else, the extension saved is like RDoc or ASCII doc. It's not Markdown, but we still show you a Markdown editor, and you can still see a Markdown preview, although it does not make sense and doesn't even work. So I think we need to have an issue to fix that as well, but that's not really a high priority. But this would go alongside that. This would have another extension of its own, and you can edit it only in the restricted editor, not the source of it.
And that would imply like deleting the original Markdown file, because you wouldn't want to keep that around. It's like an old version of it.
No, actually, there's no original Markdown file at all, because this is like if you change the format, let's say you change from Markdown to RDoc, you anyways delete the original Markdown file. It deletes the Markdown file and creates an RDoc file. So it is you're renaming the file anyway, internally at least. So,
right.
But one thing we could do is like when you're creating new pages, we should not allow switching from, like you could just disable that dropdown for any existing page, so that you don't change from the old restrict creator format to Markdown.
Okay, so I'm intrigued by this. Let me just think through like an iteration plan for it. So for MVC, you create a new page in any wiki and you choose the new GitLab Markdown format, and your editing experience now changes to use the content editor. There's no visible source yet, and we have a big warning that's like, by the way, please keep this limited to like headers and lists and common mark spec. Otherwise you're in trouble. Now you save that doc, it gets written to the repository. It's technically a Markdown file, but it's got maybe an extension or something like that to segment it away. And then
Eric, it wouldn't be a Markdown file.
No.
Yeah, I think you're mixing the two MVP approaches together there.
Okay.
So if we use this new document format, it could be something that is not Markdown at all.
So I guess I should be more specific.
Everything that ProseMirror supports. Like the benefit of Himanshu's approach is like we can iterate on the content editor, like let them do whatever they want, but they won't be able to ever work with a raw markdown. It won't even exist in the repo. So that lets them have the full access to the editing experience, but not markdown. The other MVP approach is like, okay, they have their markdown, but it's a very limited and incrementally developed markdown experience. It's like two approaches.
So let me be more specific. I don't want to write an intermediate format to the repo. If we exposed through to the user's perspective, this is a different format, but use that as the flag to say, I want to use the content editor and only ever right now want to use the content editor. If we can still write to Markdown, but discourage people from actually editing that Markdown raw source, then the content editor becomes our primary editing experience. And we can continue to iterate towards our end goal of having a fully featured Markdown editor that handles all of GitLab flavored Markdown, but still writes to Markdown source.
Okay, so you mean that we would be flagging wiki pages that are greeting with the content editor, so we can use two different type of editor depending on what is the original source of that content, right? I mean, by source, I mean which editor the user used in the first place.
Yeah, so this would be a way of saying, this would be potentially the same as just saying I'm opting into the new editor, but without being able to then opt out on a per page basis. You would say,
no,
go ahead.
So I want to add, this is something we can do iteratively. So first step would be to allow people to edit, create new content in the new format. And we don't really allow them to go back to Markdown. But eventually, as we build our extensions, we would allow people to switch from our format to Markdown. We just re-enable the drop-down. So by doing that, it would convert the format we have to Markdown, and people can edit the Markdown then.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm getting at, which is like, until we have full support, we consider it a separate file format. You can't switch between, you can't view the source in the editor. You opt in to choose the new editor, you're stuck with the new editor for this page. And we'll continue to build out support. And then eventually in that new editor, we will be able to completely cover the scope of GitLab flavored Markdown, and we will be able to show the raw Markdown source. And that editor just becomes the Markdown editor now. So then we can smush those two together.
Yeah, alternatively, we could also allow them to convert back to Markdown, but that is where we show them the warning that, hey, it might not be exactly the same as what you could expect it to be.
So that's interesting. We would explore like an opt out of the new editor to drop it back to Markdown, but then we'd say like, you can't go back. Like, you can't go back and forth or something like that, or there's risks going back and forth.
We'll say this could potentially corrupt your entire file too, for whatever we don't support so far.
Okay, let's explore this more. I'm going to set up something to. This is like a very specific user experience like challenge, but I think what we're getting at is that the MVC does not need 100% support for GitLab flavored Markdown. If we can come up with an experience that is opt-in and provides sufficient warnings for how it can be used.
Yeah, I think your comments earlier got pointed at what user segments are we most concerned about keeping happy, and at the same time, the people who want a WYSIWYG editing experience, or people who maybe just want to look at it real quick, but also it's really important they can still edit the Markdown source. Like, how big are those two cohorts comparatively?
Right. Well, and I think that we're going to find a lot of internal GitLab folks that are in the latter, which is like something we can solve for
I
in
certainly
the
wouldn't
source
use
editor,
only a
which
WYSIWYG
is,
editor.
yeah, we can write raw Markdown and preview it quickly. Like the source editor can do that. We have a proof of concept. This is the opposite. This is, you want to write visually. You want to see the headers big. You want to write using Markdown shortcuts. I'm fully comfortable with not providing the entirety of GitLab flavor Markdown for our MVC, as long as we're not risking our reputation of the editor by exposing that too soon. So we have to go to our milestone kickoff, but I would say ideally we support everything in the GitLab, rendering everything in the GitLab flavored Markdown spec, but I think we could invest more time in getting that user experience nailed down for the opt-in that could prevent files from getting corrupted. And possibly the best way to do that is only letting people opt into the editor when creating a new file and warning them if they decide to switch it back to Markdown that there's going to be some incompatibilities. Let's sit on that. We can regroup on Slack and in the issue. I'll try and summarize some of that in the epic, and we can get Michael to weigh in when he's back tomorrow. And then, yeah, appreciate the discussion though. This is very, very helpful.
Michael won't be back tomorrow. Tomorrow's Family and Friends Day.
I think he's taking it on Monday.
On Create Team Day? Like,
oh wait, yeah. What's up with that? Oh,
well,
forgot about that. Well, we will continue this discussion. Thank you, everybody, for the input.
Bye. Thank you.
See you then. Bye bye.